Hello and welcome. My name is Maddie Whittle. I am a member of the programming team at Film at Lincoln Center in New York and one of the selection committee members for the 26th edition of Rendez-Vous with French Cinema, which is our annual showcase of the best in new French cinema and Francophone cinema. And so we're really very excited to be back for this virtual edition. It's especially meaningful this year because when theaters shut down at the beginning of the pandemic last spring, Rendez-Vous was the festival that was ongoing in our theaters at the time, and so it was cut short last year's edition. And this year's edition, we're back with a fully new lineup and fully virtual, and we're very excited to be able to bring together these filmmakers, even if only in the virtual space. We can't all be together in New York, but we're together in spirit. So thank you for joining us. Today's talk is called Vive la Résistance, and I'm very excited to be joined by 5 really excellent filmmakers, 2 or 3 rather, representing 2 films from the Rendez-Vous lineup, and 2 American filmmakers who have worked in a register that is thematically similar in their recent work. So I'm hoping that the conversation can go in some interesting directions. But before we begin, let me just say, first of all, a great thank you to our friends at Unifrance, our presenting partners for Rendezvous with French Cinema. We couldn't do it without them every year. And thank you also to our board, patrons, members, and audiences, as well as our staff and volunteers year-round who make the work that we do possible. And we couldn't do it without you, the audience, as well. So please consider becoming a member if you'd like to join the community in that context. And I finally thank you to HBO, who co-presents the Film at Lincoln Center free talks that we do year-round, of which this is one. So thank you so much, HBO. And so without further ado, I'll introduce the filmmakers who are with us today. And to kick things off, I'm going to ask them some sort of focused questions about their films, and then bring everyone together in conversation. And in the last 15 minutes or so of the event, will be open to audience questions. So you should feel free to submit those throughout the talk via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom frame. So without any further ado, we can get to it. So the filmmakers who are with me this afternoon are, to start off with, Farid Bentoumi, the filmmaker of Red Soil, which is part of the Rendezvous lineup this year. As well, then we have Kitty Green, whose recent film, The Assistant, was one of the last major theatrical releases, I would say, from the sort of season leading up to theatrical closures at the beginning of 2020. I was lucky to do a Q&A with Kitty at the beginning of last year, and so we're really happy to have her back virtually. Then we have Jérémy Trouilh and Fanny Liatard, who are the filmmakers of Gagarine, which is another excellent film in this year's Rendezvous lineup. Both Red Soil and Gagarine, their streaming windows, or rental windows rather, are currently open. So you can go to filmlink.org right now and see the films if you haven't. And then finally, we're also very lucky to be joined by Reinaldo Marcus Green, whose recent film, Monsters and Men, was sort of the inspiration to bring him into this panel. And it became clear quickly that the film that, Reinaldo, that you're currently is in the premiere and release pipeline, Joe Bell, also has a lot of sort of resonances with these topics. So I hope that we can touch on both of them in this conversation. So thank you all for being here. So just to begin, I'll come back to the title of this talk, which is Vive la Résistance. I would say that resistance in the last 4 or 5 years has become sort of a buzzword. It's a hashtag. It indicates a certain political stance with very particular connotations. But I think in a broader sense, the idea of resistance can be really illuminating as a way of thinking about stories that have a particular kind of political slant to them. And looking at these films and at contemporary French cinema and contemporary American independent cinema more broadly, I see that, there's still a lot of interest in sort of the idea of a revolutionary spirit in both of these cinemas. The shared ideals that you can date back to our revolutions, and our protest movements of the past. And these films that we're bringing together today, I think all do something a little bit unique, which is to explore the individual experience of resisting oppression or fighting for change or coming to political consciousness, even in understated ways and in ways that are not explicit. I think, in each of the films that we're going to talk about, we have a protagonist who maybe doesn't fit the bill of looking like a heroic character, an extraordinary character, but over the course of the stories that are told about them, they witness an instance of systemic injustice or structural abuse of power. They object to what they're seeing, and they find a way, large or small, to push back against it and, try to change the course of things. And so that was my thinking when I wanted to bring together Red Soil and The Assistant and Gagarine and Monsters and Men. I think these films have something in common that I really want to get into today. So to do that, I'm going to first ask each one of you to talk a little bit about your films with maybe a sort of leading question. So we can start with Farid, whose film Red Soil focuses on a young woman who's a nurse working in the infirmary of a factory. And she discovers some environmental malfeasance that is going on in this factory. And so Farid, I wonder if you could just talk about how you see this film as a protest film. You talk about in your Rendezvous Q&A, you talk about your early interest in Nelson Mandela and ideas of commitment and political commitment and conviction. And so I wonder if you could just set the scene a little bit by talking about this story of a whistleblower and how that.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing me in that talk with other great directors. I saw all your movies, and I'm pretty amazed to be part of this selection. It was they were all great. What strikes me first is that when you talk about resistance, for me is like to resist, to keep a state, to keep something in the same way, to resist. I don't feel like our movies are about heroes resisting oppression. I think all our movies are about heroes wanting to change something, change the society, change maybe the way they are oppressed or the way things work. And I feel more like my whistleblower in my story, that they all want to change things, that they all want to move on, and they don't know how to do that. Everybody wants them to keep silence. That's the main thing in all our movies, and I was very impressed by that. I was also very impressed about the connection we have in the movies in the family links, which is in the center of my story, because it's the daughter fighting against her father, because her father is the union representative of the factory, and she's the nurse, and she discovers that there are toxic wastes in the factory, and also that the workers get poisoned by the toxic fumes in the factory. So she fights against her father, and her father wants the factory to go on, and he doesn't want all the workers to get unemployed and all these the city to die. In fact, because when it's a small city, the factory makes everybody leaves. So it's pretty strange to me to see that in all our movies there's a close relationship between this commitment to change things in society and the relationship we have with our families. We see that in Gagarine, when the hero doesn't have his mother anymore, and you have this link. I mean, the mother doesn't know what to do with him, and he feels alone, and you know that you feel like missing her mother, his mother, missing his father, he has to do something in the society. And it's about the same thing in The Assistant. She kind of seeks help or try to talk to her father, and she cannot. And I feel the same thing in Monsters and Men, with all this link between father and son, all this relationship inside these stories of people resisting. So I don't know if I'm quite clear in that, but I feel a lot of links between our movies.
Absolutely. And I in part, I picked you to kick us off because I do think that Red Soil has connections with each of the other films. In particular, thinking about The Assistant and the role of a whistleblower. The protagonist in the Assistant is less successful than the character at the center of Red Soil. She witnesses a systemic problem and is in a position of sort of extreme isolation within that system, and takes her objection to somebody who she thinks can help address the problem, but instead is stymied and met with sort of counter resistance. So Kitty, I wonder if you could talk about making a film about failed resistance or failed protest or stymied protest, and how you approached that sort of narrative problem.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, firstly, and I'm a big fan of everyone's work here. It's a difficult one because she is a character that tries to speak up, tries to kind of raise her concerns, and is quickly gaslit, shut down, worn down, and kind of, I guess, like swallowed up by the system itself, and becomes almost part of it by the end of the film. And but that was something, I mean, I did a lot of research. It's a film that I spoke to nearly 200 women who'd worked as assistants at various, not just film production companies, but in the film industry, but also in tech and finance and in other industries too. And what was so horrifying to me in that research process was how many people had been just turned away, how many people had quit, how many people had left, especially young women who didn't see a path for themselves through this industry and didn't kind of couldn't see an example of how they could climb the ladder. And so it was a very bleak kind of research process, which I think is reflected in kind of the ending of the film, is that this is how it was going. I think things have changed, to be honest, but the film is set almost pre the rise of the Me Too movement, when it really felt hopeless. So it is kind of reflective of that, to be honest, yes. But the film itself, while she doesn't get to resist, I think the film itself is a piece of an act of resistance, in that it is highlighting these microaggressions, sort of gendered workplaces, unconscious bias, all these things are kind of highlighted scene by scene in this movie. So an audience can kind of tell what's going on and can be a kind of, like, I guess, as angry as she was, that even though she really didn't have any sort of way to fight it, essentially, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. In a sense, the fact that the ending is so frustrating, it's almost more galvanizing that way, to encourage the audience to continue the fight. This also leads me to Gagarine, which I think in some ways is also a story, maybe not of failed protest or an effective protest, but sort of symbolic protest Yuri, the central character of Gagarine, is this young man who lives in a housing project that is about to be demolished. It's been condemned and set for demolition, and he doesn't want to leave. There's reluctance among his community, many of whom have been there for many, many years, reluctance to leaving. And his solution is one that borrows from elements of magical realism, and it's very much sort of about a spiritual protest. And at the same time, it's very, very clearly rooted in almost documentary research, because it's set in a real physical facility of the Gagarine housing projects, which were set to be demolished. So I wonder, Fanny and Jérémy, if you could talk a bit about that sort of marriage between almost documentary realism of documenting this real place on the precipice of destruction, and also the idea of sort of a symbolic protest, a protest of the imagination, which is what the film centers on.
Yeah, first, thank you very much to invite us, and we're happy to share this conference with you, all of you, and you're talented, all of you. Yes, Gagarine, we shot Gagarine in a city very close to Paris. And it's a place that we met with Jérémy in 6 years ago when we arrived in Paris, because we are from other places in France. And we kind of fell in love immediately with the architecture of the place, because it's an impressive housing project, a big building of red bricks. And immediately we learned that it was going to be demolished, and that all the stories of all these people, the 400 families living there, and was going to disappear. So what was going to disappear was this utopia of the 60s of living together in a block. We put at the beginning of the film some archives of Yuri Gagarin, the astronaut, coming in the 60s to inaugurate the building, and a lot of people were there. They believed they were going to have a better life in this place, and reach to live together in better conditions. And so that's the reality of the film. And then with Jérémy, we spent a lot of time with the inhabitants. We saw them going away little by little of this place. And the fiction came to tell the story of a young guy who still believes we can all live together, and we still believe in new utopias and that we have to invent. So we used the history and the architecture of the place to bring the fiction into all this documentarial material, and we try to keep this mix in all the process of making the film. When we were writing the script, we made a lot of workshops with the inhabitants, and then the former inhabitants of the blocks, they came also to participate to the shooting. So it was a very we mix all the time between fiction and reality. And I will let Jérémy maybe go on with
oh, well, shortly,
story.
maybe I just can add that talking about resistance for us is really close to talking about the power of imagination. Because for us, housing projects in France are usually shown the same way, through violence and poverty and drugs, and it's always the same circles shown, and always the same destinies for the characters who live there. And when we spent time there in Gagarine, we met a lot of young people with huge dreams, and very different dreams than the one you used to see on television. And so we wanted to create a character that dreams of going to space and sees his building as a spaceship. And this only fact of having a young hero who looks at his building not as trash, but as something beautiful that has to be saved, and that is inspiring for him and giving him strength, actually. Well, it's a gesture of resistance for us.
Thank you. And carrying off of that to think about Monsters and Men, Reinaldo, in some ways, your film is singular among this bunch in that it's more of an ensemble piece. It takes a few different points of view over the course of the film, and it gives sort of an expansive view of a larger story of a social justice issue that's very present and very familiar from sort of the media consciousness right now. And you take sort of a prismatic approach, looking at different ways of witnessing this injustice of police violence against Black and brown people, and different positionings around this problem. And to complement that, you show different forms of pushing back against this, this injustice, this systemic problem. You show different kinds of protests, different peaceful demonstrations, vigils, protest art with a slam poet on the street. You show sort of the community organizing of people coming together to organize a protest. And we see a protest in action that is suppressed by the police. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your interest in all of these different fields of protest and talk about how you see the film as fitting into that. Do you see this film as protest art, or do you see it as more of a documentation?
Thank you all, and congratulations on your film. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. Made the movie a while back, so I have to I have to remember now. But look, it's a very personal film. It was what I was thinking about as I was making the movie. Was sort of my experiences growing up in New York. I grew up with a father, and he worked for the Department of Investigation, and he was an attorney. And I grew up sort of in a rough neighborhood, and how all these different marriages of my personal life kind of fit into the narrative that was happening in the world around me. And I was the kid in the back of the class who, even if I had the answer, was afraid to kind of raise my hand. And I was always a little shy, and I never knew how to express those things that were happening. And there's a lot of peer pressure in New York City schools. There's a lot of peer pressure to kind of stay in your lane. And as I grew older, and I got a little bit more of a confidence in sort of how to or curiosity of how to try to tackle some issues is how I started to approach the film. Was thinking about all the people that I grew up with. And I grew up in Staten Island, New York. I don't know if anybody knows Staten Island, but it's very different than the rest of the parts of the city. It's a lot of construction workers, a lot of police officers, a lot of blue collar folks, and those people were my friends. They were people that I grew up with, and they had very opposing views to the household that I was growing up in, but they were also, so like when we came to this space, we were all friends on the field, but then they went home into their houses and they were being taught very different things. And I just found that it was very important to kind of hear, those sides of the issue. I felt that it was important to have a conversation and have that conversation be something that we can move past or move through rather than shut it down. And at the time, I don't have any social media anymore, but at the time, when I was on social media, you kind of surround yourselves around people that are like-minded, right? And oftentimes you minimize people on your feed that don't think like you or feel differently or speak out of other things. And I just felt like there was something quite wrong about that process of not being able to hear the other side, or not being able to at least try to understand where they were coming from. And so the approach of making the film was really about, what part do I play in this conversation? How do I raise my hand as that kid in the back of the class, so to speak? And where does my voice fit in this sort of new age of resistance? You have people that are out there protesting, but is that working? You have people on Twitter that are retweeting or posting stuff, and is that working? And maybe it was some combination of both. And where do I take a stance? And of course, as a young filmmaker, was thinking my film could have some part in having that conversation. A public conversation. And that was the approach to the film. But it really came from a very personal place and a personal experience. We all know the Eric Garner video that went viral. I used to deliver pizza literally on the block where that happened. So it was all in my backyard. All these issues were happening around me. Some of my best friends are police officers. So, just growing up again in that environment it was just very easy for me to tap into those conversations. I didn't have to look very far for the research. And again, it was what part do I play? I'm still asking myself that question today. Was my film enough? Should I have done more? Should I have taken more of a stance? And these are the questions that I think we constantly ask ourselves as filmmakers. Is is what is our voice in all of this? And you know, I'm proud of the movie and what it attempted to achieve. But I think there's, you know, I think there's a part two. You know, if I could do it again, you know, what are some of the things that I can do to elevate that conversation even more, or amplify the conversation even more? I don't have the answer, but you know, when I do, maybe there'll be a you know, Richard Linklater part two, before sunset, before sunrise sort of approach to figuring out how to answer those questions.
I think we all have the same questions, because it really sounds like when I wrote Red Soil, I was like you. I mean, my father was a worker in a factory, and all of his well, maybe 10 or 20 of his colleagues are all dead because of the what they breathed in the factory. And I think what happens in France and might happen in the rest of the world is the democratization of the cinema. I think more and more directors come from, I don't know, there are sons of workers, sons of policemen, sons of people working in the fields or whatever. And before that, in the 60s and 70s, the cinema belonged to the bourgeoisie. And I think that at that time, there were only stories happening in Paris or in huge cities or in huge houses. And now we're talking about real issues. I mean, issues that we didn't used to see in cinema. So when I did Red Soul, I was also talking about my family, what happened, and I really feel like you, what the talks we had at home and what we saw on screen was very different. It was two different realities. And just a small point, when I was before being a director, I was an actor, and when I was doing casting, they were always asking me to do the Arabian guy from the suburbs, like from the housing projects, and I don't come from that part of the society. I just had the opportunity to do some studies because I worked a lot when I was in high school, and grew up to be to had a real diploma, and I didn't fit in that, in what television and cinema wanted to fit me in. And I think that's what's really interesting, that I think we write to change things, and that's maybe resistance cinema comes from that. We try to write to change things, always thinking that maybe cinema is not enough, always thinking that maybe what we're doing is not enough, and maybe the commitment of our fathers and mothers were stronger than our commitments. And that's also the question I raised in Red Soil. I mean, the daughter, the nurse, she's trying to fight. She saw her father commit in union fightings and commit to protect his co-workers and protect the employment. And she feels like she has to commit in society, but she doesn't really know how. And she becomes a whistleblower. So we're all trying to find our way to resist. And I don't know if cinema is enough. We'll never know, I think. But we still do cinema because we still hope that it's going to change things, I think.
I'm interested in sort of in philosophical terms, whether you see yourselves as political filmmakers. Of course, all films are political, whether they want to be or not. But I think the films we're talking about here all tackle from one angle or another, and a political issue, an issue or a set of political issues that and the way that those issues play out in the intimate lives of people. So I wonder if any of you could just talk about whether you think of your films as how you think of your role as a filmmaker as a political role.
Okay, I'll try to say something, but it's a difficult question, of course, because I don't feel like a politician. I feel like someone trying to tell stories, and of course, the act of telling stories has an aim of connecting people together, and hopefully people who don't know each other well, and if they get to know better each other, maybe it will make things a little better. So for instance, for us, I feel that of course there was a beginning, and the beginning was political, a situation that is not fair and that has to change, and maybe this is the food of the first willing of telling a story for Fanny and I every time. But after that, when we begin to actually tell the story, we fell in love with the characters and with the place and with the stories they're going through. And so I feel that we little by little forget the political to focus on the emotions, for instance, to focus on who are these people and what makes them real and touching, and how we will empathize with them.
And I'm also interested on whether you find that changes at all once the film is out in the world. Do you feel that your perspective on your political role has, changes once a film has an audience? This is also for everybody.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have any audience this year because our movies couldn't go out in theaters. So that's pretty strange when you do a political movie or when you are committed in your movie and when you want things to change. I mean, there are so many factors in France that are rejecting toxic waste in nature, and we really have to change things now. So you make a movie to make things change, and nobody's going to see it in theaters. I mean, not right away. So that's really frustrating. It's yeah, pretty hard to answer.
No, absolutely. And I'm interested also in your particular experience making a film about an injustice within the system in which you were working. Your film's about the film industry, and I wonder if your wanting to make this movie was seen as sort of an act of protest or commentary, or did you meet resistance?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I felt like it was something that we sent out. We had this script and it's very bare bones, and we sent it out and we'd have the female executives at every company messaging and being like, I love it. We're going to make it. We're going to get it done. Like, just let my boss read it tomorrow. And then the next day we'd get this, I'm sorry, we can't do it. Like their male bosses would always reject kind of any kind of, didn't want to be associated with it. And there was a bunch of, we heard like scary kind of reasons where some of them had really bad HR departments. They didn't want to have to kind of examine their own internal structures. And so the easiest thing to do is just to not go near it, because if they do, they have to kind of, this got to figure out what's in there, kind of the skeletons in their own closet, essentially. So yeah, we had to fight really hard to get it made and to get the right people involved who allowed me to make kind of it's very pure. It is like we're not kind of, again, like I said, it's really quiet. There's not much character. So we had to find a team that understood its message and what we were trying to say, and we're on board with that, which was difficult, honestly, really tough.
You raised an interesting point, which is that your film is a fiction film, as are all four of these films. But I think all four of them could easily be documentaries, or rather, the interest that you all as filmmakers show in your subjects, it's easy to imagine how that interest could have been carried out in a documentary. And so I'm interested in the choice that you all made, which was to tell these stories as fictional stories. I know that Red Soil is based on a true story, and Gagarine is about a true place that was really condemned for demolition. And obviously The Assistant and Monsters and Men, the resonances with real world events are very clear. But you all made fiction films and invented these stories. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit about that choice, and also how you played around with genre, because I think each of these films is doing something very interesting with genre. We have an eco-thriller and sort of a workplace monster movie, almost horror film, and a sort of magical realist sci-fi inflected drama, and then a sort of an ensemble drama that is sort of epic in scope. So just throwing that out there, I'm interested in the choice to tell these stories as fiction.
But it's true that Red Soil is based on a true story. Actually, it's based on several true stories, because I wrote about this factory that's in the south of France, and it rejects toxic waste that red. So it was interesting for me to show this red soil. It was like a dirt, split of dirt on true natural environments, which, because the story now is settled is set in the mountains in the French Alps. And it's also based on different stories of whistleblowers that I heard, because I wrote during 2 years, and during those 2 years I made like a journalistic work, writing a lot of, reading a lot of articles, reading a lot of books, seeing all the movies about whistleblowers. Of course, Erin Brockovich, of course, the Pentagon Papers, of course. I don't know, there are so many. But then there's a whole work to create fiction, as Jeremy said, that you have to create heroes and create the empathy to enter these political movies. And for me, the empathy comes with the family links. When you enter the family, everybody has a family, so everybody can relate to that, and everybody can enter in this intimate circle. And then with this intimate circle, we enter the fiction. And to talk about this documentary part, when I write, I always when I after one year or 1.5 years, when I have this scenario, I make it read to a nurse, a journalist, director of factory, a union guy, so that all my characters are based on real experience, and they all say, oh no, I wouldn't talk like that. Oh no, it wouldn't happen like that. Oh no, a journalist wouldn't say that. Oh, when you're a nurse, when you enter a factory, it doesn't really happen like that. So my scenario is based on real experiences, so that the actors can have a strong base to work on their character, on their fictional character. The fiction is based on a strong, true base.
For Gagarine, it could have been a documentary, I think, but the first willing, as Jeremy said, was really to make a step aside. In a way, we're looking at a housing project in France, and so it was like a game to bring space, because it was part of the history of the place also, into a very realistic situation. I think we had also the desire of making entertainment and to really play with this mix of filming the building as a spaceship, and so play with the colors and the aesthetic, willing also to make the message pass. So the fiction was like a game for us, I think, and it appeared immediately as the best way to make Yuri, our character, exist also, because we met a lot of young people. They could have been the heroes of our film, but we didn't find in the real life a young guy who dream about space. So we invented him, but I'm sure he exists somewhere. Yeah.
Let's see. I have a few questions from the audience, and we're getting near to the last quarter of the hour. So I'm going to start relaying some of the audience questions. And if you're watching and you think of a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A function, and we'll find it there. So Joshua Youngerman asks, thinking about both Monsters and Men and The Assistant, and I would actually add to this Red Soil as well. There are scenes where the character's class or class status is weaponized against them in order to prevent them from resisting. I was wondering if you could talk about both of these scenes, which strike this viewer as very accurate for workers in the workforce and the way some bosses treat their employees. And I'll just add that there's the sort of realism of these workplace settings is clearly crucial to the sort of message of these movies, to the extent that there is a message. And so just have at it.
Do you want to go? Do you want me to go? Okay. I had with the assistant, it was specifically an HR scene. So it was, and I had spoken to a lot of women who had gone to HR with a complaint and had found they left confused, rattled. I was looking to kind of almost use it as an example of gaslighting, talking about that kind of what's going on in those places. They're particularly, I mean, the HR is sort of, you think it's there to protect the employees, but it's actually there to protect the company. And so that was something I was sort of playing with in that scene. But in that scene, it's kind of working in a few different ways, because he does make fun of her for living in Queens, but he also makes her feel bad for judging the waitress for being a waitress and not having enough experience. So there's kind of a few things going on there. And I feel like it is that kind of gaslighting thing where he's just throwing everything at her and completely destabilizing her. So yeah, it's a more complex than just him poking kind of at her. He's kind of, I don't know, it's a 12-page scene, and it was kind of amazing. Also, the two actors are really incredible, and they just found so much more depth and texture with it whenever they did it each time, again and again, every time they do the entire 12 pages. And it found its shape, I think, in that process. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, but it sort of is firing in different directions for sure.
Yeah, I would say in Monsters and Men, obviously, the police officer role played by John David. He's, the police in New York or in any place is an institution. And so it's like being in the army. Once you put on the uniform, you represent what every uniform in every city and every country represents. And there's lots of divisions. There's lots of it's really big. And even if you're doing the right thing and you have your heart in the right place, oftentimes there are people that work under the same banner that may not have the same intentions. And then what do you do within that system that you're trying to, I guess, live by? I think the core of that question is I think every police officer, at least the ones that I know, get into it for the right intentions. They get in there to protect and serve. They get into these places because they think that they can make a difference. And then they realize that the issues are much bigger than them, but their livelihoods are tied to that. If what you've decided as your career and what pays your bills and what allows you to provide for your family is tied to something that is almost bigger for one person to change, you're kind of put into that situation. And that's where we find our character in this particular movie, who I think had every intention of being a great police officer, doing the right thing, maybe comes from a lineage of police officers. And then what, what are you going to do? And then where do you go? You go to corporate America? I mean, do you go into the education system? And you find, no matter where you are, very similar problems are within a lot of these institutions. They're just masked under different, different banners. And so, yeah, I mean, I think class is always a question when you're dealing with these kind of things. Especially, and in my film, I think the police officer role is the one that I think best demonstrates that.
Well, I have a lot of admiration for the whistleblowers. I think it's pretty hard. Usually, these stories are tragedies. When you asked before, why didn't I do a documentary? It's because the fiction is whistleblowers are heroes. They are tragedy heroes, and that's why it became a thriller. I mean, in the end, she wins, but she should lose, and there are a lot of usually whistleblowers that lose in the end, because because you have the pressure, you have the peer pressure of the other workers when you work in a factory. You also have the pressure of the director of the factory. You also have the pressure of the whole town around you. I mean, I've heard stories of workers becoming whistleblowers, and people would spit on them in the supermarket, and they lost their wife because their wife say, "Why did you become a whistleblower? You had 3 kids. I mean, and now you're unemployed," and they lost their job, and usually they are on blacklists, so that they never find jobs anymore. Even whistleblowers in the bank industry. So it's tragedies. It's very hard. The first title of Red Soul was "Stay Quiet." That was the first title, and I think that's the danger. It's the scene in The Assistant is wonderful. It's wonderfully done, and wonderfully the actors are wonderful, and it sums up everything. How hard it is to become a whistleblower, and the risk you take.
These answers are actually making me want to add to this question a little addendum for Jérémy and Fanny about Gagarine, because in some ways, unlike the other films in this group, Gagarine doesn't depict in great detail the workings of the system of power that's creating this oppression. You know, it doesn't really get into the politics of why Gagarine is being demolished, and who made that decision, and who's holding the purse strings, and I wonder if you could just talk about that decision not to get into sort of the institutional specifics of that decision, but instead focusing on sort of the experience of somebody on the receiving end.
Well, maybe I would say that we decided not to show the oppressor, because the oppressor is usually invisible in this kind of situations. The state, the lack of investment, the decades of abandonment of public powers in front of those places and the people who live in those territories is the real enemy. And this enemy is invisible, even more invisible for the people who live in such housing projects, who try to reach a social assistant or the owner of the building and will never get someone on the phone, you know. And so you have one brief scene when the engineer comes to attest that the building is not good enough. I think in this brief scene, you can see the feeling of impuissance,
the powerlessness?
Yes, thank you. Of some inhabitants who say, it's never us that you will listen to. And Yuri is on another level, our hero. He's just already acting and trying to save by his own means what he has, his building, his community, his family. But I hope that we feel that if he's afraid of going outside of his building, it's maybe also because he feels that he's not welcome outside of this building, and that society is not welcoming enough. And when he's sending an SOS to the world, it's an act of calling for help. And who is he calling to? The entire society, of course, but also the people in power.
I have a question that's addressed to Farid from the audience, but I think also, once again, can sort of be extended to each of the films. But Anne-Catherine Tietze says, Farid, you show how the toxins are also sinking into the personal interactions visually we see a poisonous wound hidden in the forest. Can you talk about how you worked on combining the two? And more broadly, I would just say, ask each of you how you sort of wove the narrative into the aesthetic of the film, and how you created a visual language or a sort of spatial language for showing these dynamics and these conflicts.
I build the image of the movie around two things. We're more and more inside the factory, and more, and then the movie ends down in the basement of the factory in this tunnel, and we're more and more into the red color. There's no red color in clothes or in any sets, in any apartments, nowhere. The only red color is when she goes to the wedding of her sister, and there's this big fight with her father, and that's when the truth comes out. That when she spits the truth like that to her father, and then there's more and more red dust in the factory. And at first we don't see it. When she first visits the factory, it's very light. We don't really see it, and it becomes more and more red until she goes in nature, and in this forest we see that actually it's all visual effects. It's not real. We did it was a beautiful lake in the French Alps actually, and it's all fake. but it's since it's based on a true story, it really exists actually. There's this factory in south of France. They really have this toxic waste. It's red and it's huge, and it's hidden. There are roads all around. It's on a hill like that, and there's a hole in the hill, and there are roads all around. You cannot see it. It's really well done. Nobody can see it. So I tried to do the same thing. Like nobody can see it. It's a red dot like that in the middle of the forest. And yeah, I think that's why does it answer the question? Yeah.
For Gagarine, it was a challenge for us to find the right balance between magic and realism. So we wanted the film to go into space, to be into space, but we decided to start in a very living block. The inhabitants are there, and the space is just the imagination of you. Is just a passion of a teenager and nothing else. He has posters in his room, and so to find a coherence, we decided to always see the things by the eyes of Yuri, the character. So the passion for space is just in his room, and then little by little is more and more isolated in his building, and the imagination is going out his head and spreading into the building. So we go also with the image, but also with the sound, we go more and more into space till finish completely into the cosmos. So and the colors also were important for us, because all his daily life is in blue and green, and when Yuri is dreaming, and when his dreams are taking all the place, it's becoming red. So it's going, the movie is getting red also, but not in the same way.
I would just say for Masses Men, it's a film about perspective. So obviously it's a triptych in its form. We had originally, it was sort of more constructed like a Monos Peros or, and I love that film, and I really tried to, like, page by page try to make the connections, and I failed. So we ended up having a slightly more siloed structure, and I used another film, Elephant, by Gus Van Sant, as a sort of a way to I thought the camera work in that film and how they moved from character to character was really interesting to me, and how you can all be connected in the same place, but also just continue to sort of move. Apologies. My son's timer somewhere. But yeah, so the language of the film, was also very self-contained in one school, and I thought, could you do that in a neighborhood? So I sort of combined my passion for those two movies and try to come up with a visual language for how I would transition from one story to the next story, trying to make them feel connected by a neighborhood, but also making them feel distinct in their perspective. So that's how my failed attempt at making a bad version of Crash ended up becoming what you see as as the structure of our film.
Yeah, I was very limited by the setting. It's an office building. It's gray walls, gray carpet, fluorescent lights. There wasn't much we could really do visual. We had to kind of figure out, there's only so much we could do with the lighting. We couldn't, it's almost like we tried to we reference Fincher and Zodiac and these kind of gloomy office spaces, but really anything that didn't seem like an authentic office lighting setup was false. So what we leaned on really heavily was the sound, actually, to be honest. And it became, and you mentioned Reinaldo Elephant, which is, the soundtrack of Elephant is one of the best soundtracks. There's barely any music. It's built up of sort of environmental sound in a really beautiful way. And so I tracked down that sound designer, who's Leslie Schatz, and we got him involved to do the same thing with the assistant, where he went out and recorded sirens and beeps and hums and whistles, and so we could create tension really with these kind of really sort of sounds you hear every day, sort of really mundane sounds, but you can really kind of pitch them up in frequency or volume, or really play with them in order to kind of give us what we needed that we couldn't get out of almost the surroundings. So yeah, it's a bit of everything, really trying to balance it so it felt authentic, but also we could heighten it when we needed to and play around. So yeah.
Well, thank you all. I see that, I could keep going, but I see that we're at 3:00 and I don't want to hold people too late, so I'll wrap it up there. But thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us, and thank you to the audience as well for your questions and for checking out the films. And Red Soil and Gagarine will remain on our virtual cinema for a few more days for their screening window and Rendez-Vous. And Monsters and Men and The Assistant, you can find them both, I believe, streaming. I should have checked where, but I forgot to write it down. But thank you all. And
thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Bye.